Love your little camera.
He did the hard part. Rain. So when I went up to the mail the other day, it was hard rain.
Yes,
So
yes.
Jeff said,
Am I on
"Leave it
now?
out there. It's hard. Hard rain."
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming to Book Sandwich Den. We only have, after Andy presents, 2 more Book Sandwich Den left in the series. I am so happy to have our What Library trustee here with us today to present on Tahanu. Is that how we say it?
Tahanu.
Tahanu. So I'm going to turn this over to Andy today so that we can learn a little more about the book. So
Okay.
take it away.
I just flew in here from Silvernail Drive this morning, and boy, are my arms tired. You know that joke? When I read this book, though, I am flying, and I'm flying on dragon's wings because it's a book that takes me away, and that's why I wanted to talk about it today. Ursula K. Le Guin, very famous science fiction writer, and famous for this series of books which we'll talk about today, which are the Earthsea trilogy. She wrote The Left Hand of Darkness, which is a Hugo Award winner science fiction book. The Lathe of Heaven, you might have heard of. That's sci-fi from early days. The Dispossessed, and then she also wrote a book called Always Coming Home, which she kind of reinvented California, and an incredibly imaginative writer. And with the Earthsea books, she wrote 3 books that were generally aimed at young people. I'll talk about them a little bit, but she kind of started this aiming at a young adult kind of reader level. And then wrote 3. They were lauded, they're fantastic. They're set in the archipelago of Earthsea, which we'll see in a bit. And then she stopped with a beautiful trilogy, and then wrote many other things, and then came back to Earthsea 16 years later with Tahanu, which is the book we're talking about today. And we'll talk about why she wanted to reinvent her world and why that's so great. Thanks a lot for coming. Sorry if you want to move up to the front, that's okay. A bit about me. My wife and I came to Canandaigua back in late '85. We've been not quite regulars because that's not long enough to be in Canandaigua to be thought of as a local maybe, but we've been here a long time. Kids were raised here. We were married in '83 before we came here. I worked at the radio station when I first came to Canandaigua, WCGR, WFLC. Messed around with that, but I lost my radio wings in '91 when I got let go. And what was I going to do? Wasn't too sure. Had a couple of opportunities in Rochester, but didn't really want to make the commute. One day, the superintendent of schools came to the door and said, "We have a job for you." And Frida, who is here today, was on the Board of Education at the time, so I want to again thank you for helping keep me in Canandaigua. The district employed me, and then as the public relations officer essentially for the district, and worked 26 years there, and retired in 2018, and it was a great career. I became a trustee of this library 2.5 years ago, whatever. Library is kind of in my heart and soul because my mom was a children's librarian. She worked in Plainfield, New Jersey, where I grew up in a little town called Watchung in New Jersey, and my mom was children's librarian at the Plainfield Public Library. Plainfield is a very, very diverse community. In fact, probably mostly black at most of the time she worked there, which gave me many opportunities for a little diverse upbringing that I might have had if I just had done everything in Watchung, which was a lily white suburb perched on the hill about 20 miles outside of New York. But the key thing for both my mom and my dad and for me was that I basically buried in books when I was a kid. Librarian mom, dad was an engineer, but he loved reading and books, and he loved Mark Twain and all that kind of stuff, so we had stuff all over the place. But one of the things that was really fun was my mom would bring home books for me to read because they were considering them for the library, and she wanted a young person's perspective. So amongst those books were many of the fantasies. You might think of Lord of the Rings, and we'll mention that, but Lloyd Alexander wrote a series called the Prydain series. The most famous that you might know is the Black Cauldron, that you might have heard of. That was a special series for me as well. The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. It's an English classic. Alan Garner, also an English writer, The Wizard of Brisingamen, which was it's an amazing story. And then on the shelf, sort of simmering there, unread by me because it was too big and too dense at the time, was The Lord of the Rings. But it had this magnetic pull. But the shelves had the magnetic pull all the way. We had National Geographic out the yin-yang. We had piles and piles of New York Times. We had a lovely magazine called the Horizon magazine, which was a hardbound magazine, and Dad had it, years and double shelves of the Horizon cultural magazine. History, art, literature was just great to crack open, even when I didn't know what the heck was going on. And some of the first real books that I read were my dad's collection of the Harvard Children's Classics, which were bound in red sort of gloriously. And they were books like Treasure Island and Robinson Crusoe and Robin Hood. And then the one which I remember opening and saying, I don't have the slightest idea what's going on here. And I could never get through it, which was Through the Looking Glass, the Lewis Carroll book, which is really bizarre, especially if you read it as a kid. It's like, and when it's Disneyfied, it can be kind of understood, but when you read the book, it's wild, and it still is. However, all those books just always transported me, so that was wonderful. And the other key thing that my mom and dad did was they never thrust a book on me. It was always, maybe here's one that you might like, or just, find it. So it was discovery. There was one time that Dad broke that mold, though, I have to mention. He brought me a Playboy magazine. And he said, here, read this, and then he left the room, and I was like, whoa. And he had given me a short story called Duel by a guy named Richard Matheson. And he's most famous for a story called I Am Legend, which has been made into a movie 3 times. And he also wrote 15 or 20 episodes of The Twilight Zone. Really fine storyteller. And I have to say, I did read Duel, because Dad said I should read it, and it was great, I also did look at the pictures, I did. I was 15 at the time, and it just was like, what a great dad, And then, after a little while, my mom brought me the original 3 books of Earthsea. These were published in 1968, The Wizard of Earthsea, 1970, The Tombs of Atoan, and The Farthest Shore is from 1972. And I just thought they were treasures in my hand. I'm thrilled to these books. They were so fascinating because they had a great heroic tale, the tale of Ged, who's the young boy who kind of grows up through this whole series. He becomes the greatest wizard of Earthsea. He saves Earthsea a couple of different ways. And in The Tombs of Atoan, the second book, he meets a character who is the Eaten One, who is a priestess in the lands of Atoan, which are sort of barbaric land, if you will. And she has been groomed since youth and stolen from her parents and raised as the priestess to the dark powers. Ged, who is the other character, the Wizard of Earthsea, is looking to, he's on a quest. He's going to find the magic ring of Erith Akbi, and all that you don't have to worry about, but he goes into the labyrinth of the dark powers, and he stumbles upon this young girl, who's this priestess, And they kind of strike up a relationship as she discovers that he's wandering down below in her realm. And she slowly gets curious about what the heck else could be going on in the world. And it's very fascinating as a young person to read that because that's what you are. You're curious about what's going on in the rest of the world. And it opens up that door a little bit. But crucially, it introduces these two characters to each other. They eventually escape the labyrinth together. Ged is the superpower wizard in a way. She has no power. She's a young girl and a woman to be. But she is held in great renown because she is partially responsible for healing Earthsea, at least to a degree. So you need to know that as a background. It is not essential to have read these books to enjoy Tehane, but it's really helpful because there's so much in these books that allows you to appreciate the riches of Tehane. So anyway, these books are challenging, they're graceful, they're very deep. I felt like they were the best books that I owned because of the wisdom that I could discover within them. And as a kid, young, adolescent, it was amazing what I could glean from these books. And it was so fun to plumb their depths for all those years. And Le Guin's writing really inspires me to this day because it's lovingly crafted. And as we saw in the quote that was up at the beginning, she cares about how words are written and how they work upon you. This is Earthsea. This is the archipelago of Earthsea. You can see that it's pretty complicated. She drew this map to help her write the books, and did it, I guess, in the early days of writing the first book. And I guess to point out, this Anawan is over here in the far corner. It's the little island that's kind of, see, Kargad lands. These are sort of barbaric people, and crucially, well, I didn't think crucially, but interestingly, those are the white folks. And all the rest of Earthsea are colored. She flipped these people, and that was an interesting thing to do in the late 60s. However, for me, reading the book, and probably because of my Plainfield upbringing and my mom's, and my many times, just having a window into the Black American world as it was in Plainfield, in the wake of serious riots in '65, and all that was going on with Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights era, that to me, that disappeared almost immediately. One of the controversial things about all the covers of Earthsea books was that that was wiped out, and that the character was often portrayed, Ged, the wizard, as white, even though he wasn't. But he wasn't Black American. He was Earthsea. And so most of the cultural pieces of all that we're just kind of not really worried about. But interestingly, she set up the barbarians as being the white folks, and the people who are reasoned and using magic in an interesting way were all the rest. In the center of the Earthsea is Havnor. That's the main where the power is, and there's a king there, or used to be. And then the island of Gaunt is kind of it's like there. That's where Ged is from, and that's where this story is also set. In the 3 books, you're all over the place, and you kind of get to know Earthsea. But as I mentioned before, Le Guin herself later came to want to understand Earthsea to a greater degree, and that's why she wrote this book. I'm going to read you a section which will give you an idea of how cool Earthsea is. And this is at the beginning of this book. A couple things have happened that are very important. The character who was the previous priestess of Adawan is now living on Gaunt. She's middle-aged. She has married and had 2 children, and those children are grown up and gone. And then her husband, Farmer Flint, normal guy, was a good farmer, relatively well off, but nothing great. Decent farm, nice house, sort of. he passes away, and now she's a widow. She has reached the very apogee kind of power next to Ged in the 3 books, and now Le Guin has reinvented her as a powerless widow who has explored the rest of her life in between the time that we've met her in all these books. At the very beginning of Tehanu, a horror has occurred. A child, a girl, abused, maybe raped, has been found half burned, her head burned in the embers of a dying fire. She's just maimed. It's a horrible thing. She's barely alive. The villagers who discover her come to this woman who is now known as Goha. This is her name, her use name is Goha. And Goha once knew power. They all know that she knew the archmage of Bsi. She even knew the king, the new king. But she's just Goha now. Still, they come to her thinking, she must know something. She must have some power. And she's been called to do something. In an act of defiance, she adopts the destroyed child. She says that to the dark powers that kind of linger inside of her, she says, I served them and I left them. I will not let them have you. And she says that both to herself, to the dark powers, and maybe to men as well. Because one of the things that's going on with Tehanu is a sort of, I don't want to overstate this, but it's a bit of a feminist reinvention. And that's the criticism that this book got when it was published in 1990. But that theme begins to come into the book pretty early. So Goha calls the little girl Theru, and more than a year later, her former mentor, who was also the mentor to Ged, the wizard I mentioned, is another wizard, Ogayan, who is now elderly, lives on Gant. He sends a messenger to her and says, come to him because he's dying. And she loves him, and she says, I have to do that. And Goha sets off with the little child walking from their village. This is the island, the Isle of Gant. You see 10 alders way up here, that's where Ged is from, but Oak Springs is kind of down here, this Beach Springs area, and that's where they're going to walk, and they're going to go over to this Ray Albi, which is a little village near the capital, which is Gulfport, overlooking the sea, and they have to walk. Here's Oak Village, so they're going to walk across here, pretty far, 50 miles, so, and it's going to take a long time because Theru is a broken child. We're going to see a man, an old man, called Ogayan, said Tinar, as they trudged along the narrow road that wound upward through the forest. He's a wise man and a wizard. Do you know what a wizard is, Theru? Well, neither do I, said Tinar, but I know what they can do. When I was young, older than you, but young, Ogayan was my father, the way I'm your mother now. He looked after me and tried to teach me what I needed to know. He stayed with me when he'd rather have been wandering by himself. He liked to walk all along these roads like we're doing now, and in the forests, and in the wild places. He went everywhere on the mountain looking at things, listening. He always listened, so they called him the Silent. When he used to talk to me, he told me stories. Not only the great stories everybody learns, the heroes and the kings and the things that happened long ago and far away, but stories that only he knew. And I'll tell you one of these stories now as we walk. It's about shape-changing, but Ogayan said it was beyond all shape-changing he knew, because it was about being two things, two beings at once, and in the same form. And he said that this is beyond the power of wizards. But he met with it in a little village around the northwest coast of Gant, a place called Kemeh. There was a woman there, an old fisherwoman, way up there, Kemeh. She was not a witch, not learned, but she made songs. That's how Ogayan came to hear of her. He was wandering there, the way he did, going along the coast listening, and he heard somebody singing mending a net or caulking a boat and singing as they worked, farther west than west beyond the land, my people are dancing on the other wind. It was a tune and the words both that O'Guyan heard, and he had never heard them before. So he asked where the song came from, and from one answer to another he went along to where somebody said, oh, that's one of the songs of the woman of Kamei. So he went on along to the village of Kamei, a little fishing port, where the woman lived, and he found her house down by the harbor, and he knocked on the door with his Maja's staff, and she came and opened the door. And in that first moment, he told me it was no woman he saw at all in the doorway, but a blaze and glory of fire, and a glitter of gold scales and talons and the great eyes of a dragon. They say you must not look into a dragon's eyes. And then that was gone, and he saw no dragon but an old woman standing there in the doorway, a bit stooped, a tall old fisherwoman with big hands, and she looked at him as he did at her, and she said, come in, Lord O'Guyan. So he went in. She served him fish soup, and they ate, and they talked by her fire, and he thought, she must be a shape changer. But he didn't know, whether she was a woman who could change herself into a dragon, or a dragon who could change herself into a woman. And finally he said, are you woman or dragon? And she did not say, but she said, I'll sing you a song I know. And then the narrative pauses for a moment and says, Theru, the little child, had a little stone in her shoe. They stopped at the side of the road to get that out, and I went on very slowly, for the road was climbing steeply between cut banks of stone, overhung by thickets where the cicadas sang in the summer heat. And so this is the story she sang to him, to O'Guyan. When Sugoi raised the islands of the world from the sea in the beginning of time, the dragons were the firstborn of the land, and the wind blowing over the land. So the song of creation tells us. But her song told us then, in the beginning, dragon and human were all one. They were all one people, one race, winged and speaking the true language. They were beautiful and strong and wise and free. But in time, nothing can be without becoming. So among the dragon peoples, some became more and more in love with flight and wildness, and would have less and less to do with the works of making, or with study and learning, or with houses and cities. They wanted only to fly farther and farther, hunting and eating their kill, seeking more freedom and more. Others of the dragon people came to care little for flight, but gathered up treasure, wealth, things made, things learned. They built houses, strongholds to keep their treasures in, so they could pass all they gained to their children, ever seeking more increase and more. And they came to fear the wild ones, who might come flying and destroy all their dear hoard, burn it up in a blast of flame, out of mere carelessness and ferocity. The wild ones feared nothing, but they were ignorant, and they could not save themselves when the flightless ones trapped them as animals and killed them. But other wild ones would come flying and set the beautiful houses afire and destroy and kill, and so there was chaos. And so those who had been both dragon and human changed, becoming two peoples, the dragons always fewer and wilder, scattered by their endless, mindless greed and anger, in the far islands of the Western Reach, way out there on the left side of this picture and beyond. And meanwhile, the human folks, always more numerous in the rich towns and cities, filling up the inner isles and all the south and east. But among them were some who saved the learning of the dragons, the true language of the making, and these are now the wizards. But also the song said, there are those among us who know they once were dragons, and among the dragons there are some who know their kinship with us. And these say that when the one people were becoming two, some of them, still both human and dragon, went not east but west, on over the open sea, till they came to the other side of the world. And there they live in peace, great winged beings, both wild and wise, with human mind and dragon heart. And so she sang, farther west than west, beyond the land, my people are dancing on the other wind. And so O'Gyan himself wondered, where is the wholeness of Earth's sea if there are both human people, dragon people, and people who are both human and dragon? This is a total reinvention, really, from where Le Guin was in the first 3 books. And it becomes a pivot point that is exciting for the reader to discover and fascinating to follow as things go on. But it gives you a sense of how much Le Guin kind of invented the world and then expanded this world into something which was highly dramatic, kind of faithful to the tropes of fantasy, but also pushing them further. This is a drawing from this gigantic book, which is a compilation of all of the books that my wonderful wife just bought me this past week because I was going to do this. And in one of the drawings here, of course, see a dramatic dragon. And the 2 characters on the far right are Ged, the Wizard of Earthsea, with his staff still, and Tanana. She's holding up the Ring of Aerith Acme, which does not play in too much in Tahanu, but that's one idea of maybe what they looked like. Le Guin herself was happy with these illustrations before she passed away. She liked them and approved them for publication in this book. One of the other key things in that passage I just read you is I really love how there's just that little stoppage for the child to remove a stone from her shoe. Brings everything back down to earth while we're talking about one of these mythic pieces of Earthsea. And Le Guin will often do that. Tahanu was published in 90, 18 years between the publication of Tahanu and The Farthest Shore. And she herself, Le Guin, had begun to wonder about the wholeness of this whole world. And she set out to discover that essential truth as writer and discoverer of her invented world. And I think she succeeds in a fantastic way to find the essential truth about Earthsea by writing Tahanu. It is the pivot point for reimagining all the truths of Earthsea, reimagining men, women, their role in Earthsea, and why magic worked and why it might be failing, which she kind of pushes out in further books. She found that the wholeness lay in incorporating all of the people of Earthsea, male and female, human and dragon, and what she finished with was a reinvention unique to the whole genre of high fantasy. It was very highly criticized by mostly men for alleged feminism, but actually it's not a feminist creed in any way that I can understand. It's not even a castigation of the talents of man or the overwhelming superiority of the culture of man. It's actually a lifting up to equality of the contributions of woman. And it equalizes the role of women in the world of Earthsea in a way that Le Guin herself wanted to see happen in our own world. And it's very, very powerful in that way. That whole thing really, she was hoping it might resonate in our world. It really resonated with me when I first read it in late 90, a gift from my mom. What a mom. It was really revelatory for that elevation in perspective. Something that you didn't really see, especially in that genre. I mean, yeah, Betty Friedan is writing and there's feminist movement, but not in fiction so much up to that point, and certainly not in sci-fi and or fantasy. So she's like an archaeologist kind of digging for more layers in her own world of Earthsea and bringing up those layers of meaning and passages of depth to make the whole story more human, more grounded in the contributions of both genders. And I admired the story, I admired the craft, and I really admired the courage of Le Guin to kind of reinvent her own world. It's her world in certain ways, and she's very, she loves that world. She loves getting lost in Earthsea, and yet she has the courage to make it different when she begins to explore it as a writer. It also made me want to, go to Earthsea, kind of like how people respond to Middle Earth in Lord of the Rings, but also made me kind of want to participate more in Canandaigua in a way. It's a book that moved me to say, you can't just always be a bystander. You need to at least contribute somehow. And that was 90, 91 when I read it. It was right at the time when I was losing the radio job and maybe moving into what was to come. But I didn't know what was going on in my own life at that very moment. So it made me want to fly above Canandaigua Lake and soar on the elder wind as well. This is the title drawing for Tehanu in the big compilation. And this is the line about I served them and I left them and I will not let them have you. And this is how Le Guin, in very spare writing, explains how difficult it is for Tehanu to draw her own birth. And it's not complicated, it's not tricky, but I find a phrase like that so beautiful and meaningful. And that's, Le Guin's writing is often that way. Extremely simple, crystalline, but poetic. And it's very moving all the way. There's very little difficulty for you to really understand Tehanu if you just take it without reading the other three, but it's helpful to read the other three. There's so much wisdom and little koans embedded in lots of these books. For example, there's a line, Ged, listen to me now. Have you never thought how danger must surround power as shadow does light? And, it's a poetic kind of out there kind of statement, and yet for me that whole thing works about, yes, if you have power, one violation you get into that outside darkness, shadow, just like shadow surrounds a single light bulb burning in the darkness, which we are drawn to both in religion, a single light, it's a great metaphor for wisdom, and yet always surrounding that is the possibility of violation and or danger. Large part of Le Guin's genius in her settings and characterizations and dialogue is that generosity of revealed wisdom. Her wisdom is rarely declared, they don't come down as commandments. It comes down as a discovery, a realization, like finding a great book on the shelf that you didn't think that you would ever stumble upon. And I think it reveals Le Guin's own confidence in her writing. She implies to the reader, I think you're smart enough to grasp and assimilate my point yourself. She credits you with a lot of smarts in her writing, and I love that. I often hate it when a writer just pounds me over the head with their point. And she rarely does. It's usually delivered through dialogue, builds directly out of characterization. And here's another little example. This is a conclusion of a long dialogue, and it's the reflection of the character Ged. He said after a little while, almost to himself, I see why you say that only men do evil, I think. Even sharks are innocent, they kill because they must. And that is why nothing can resist us. Only one thing in the world can resist an evil-hearted man, and that is another man. In our shame is our glory. Only our spirit, which is capable of evil, is capable of overcoming that evil. And that's at the end of a dialogue, that's not a commandment. It's not something that's original to this world, but it's stated in a different way, and it's a realization. So it feels very earned as both the reader and the writer, and because it's earned, it sort of lodges a little more strongly in the head, and you can hopefully apply it in a stronger way. This is a little image of Sinar and Ged speaking in front of the cottage that was the former wizard's O'Gion's cottage. And this is a statement by Tanar about how she is growing into her individualism. And she's casting aside the power of Earthsea, which is embedded in the wizards and Roke. And on Roke, and the island of Roke, where the wizard school is, a school of wizardry, by the way, that's 30 years before Hogwarts, is this idea that you understand the language of the making. If you understand the language of the making, you can understand, you will be able to give the true name of any object or person to that person or object. If you have the true name, you have power. If you know that a rock is named, I'll make it up this time because I can't remember, rock, right? And if you say that, and you can manipulate the rock, you can make it fly. It's still a rock. But because you have the name of the rock, in the true making, the true language of the world, you can effect magic upon the rock. You know, and then that pulls out to people in the sense of, if I have control of a person, I do it through knowing their true name. Now, Tinar, that's her true name. Goha is her use name, and everyone calls her Goha. But her best people, or the wizards who know her and respect her, call her Tinar. If an evil person knows that her name is Tinar, especially if it's a wizard, that wizard might have power over her. And that's kind of the origin and how magic works on Earthsea, all through language, which goes back to the dragons, who speak only in the language of the making. So all things tied together, and I don't know if it really made sense there, but to me, the idea that naming is the key to magic is extremely interesting and logical. And part of the reason why I love Earthsea so much, it's not some outside, unexplained magic. There's a logic to that magic, and there's a school that teaches that logic. The school has kept women out all the years. And in her reinvention, she kind of allows women back in, which changes Earthsea forever and to the good. But that happens a little bit later. But here, Tanara is saying, when Ogan taught me here at the hearth, she always brings it back to the essence of life at the hearth or before the fire, or while we're cooking, or while we're darning, or spinning yarn, or slopping the pigs, or whatever. Very earthly. The words of the old speech, I could understand them, but the rest, the lore, the runes of power, the spells, the rules, the raising of the forces, that was dead to me. That was by rote. That was something to be used for control, not something else. It was somebody else's language. So I used to think I could be dressed up as a warrior with a lance and a sword and a plume and all, but it wouldn't fit, would it? What would I do with a sword? What would it make me a hero? I'd be myself in clothes that didn't fit. I'm a woman. I'd be hardly able to walk. So I took it off and I put on my own clothes. And so Le Guin is saying she wants all women to do that. But she's taken a character who we've met before, who is dominated by the male orientation of the whole culture in the previous book, and now she's bringing Tanara to the fore as a hero, but not a hero brandishing a big sword and brandishing magic. A hero because she has learned what her own strength is, and that she can apply that as she goes. It's also a book which it sort of illuminates the female condition in wonderful ways. I'm not going to be able to cover all of this, but here's a picture of the dragon. Just for fun, let's do a little description of I was talking about her simple writing, but also incredible descriptions as well. The dragon flies to Gunt to bring the wizard who you see up on the dragon back to Gunt. At the end of the previous book, he has expended all his magical powers, kind of saving Earthsea, to put it simply. But now he's lost his magic. And the dragon brings him back, and who does he bring him back to but Tanar? And so the dragon flies in. She gazed at that faint dream shape, dreaming until a bird flying from the west over the sea drew her gaze. It was not a gull, for it flew steadily and too high to be a pelican. Was it a wild goose or an albatross? The great rare voyager of the open sea come among the islands? She watched the slow beat of the wings far out and high in the dazzling air, and then she got to her feet, retreating a little from the cliff's edge, and stood motionless, her heart going hard and her breath caught in her throat, watching the sinuous, iron dark body borne by long webbed wings as red as fire, the outreaching claws, the coils of smoke fading behind it in the air. Straight to Gaunt it flew, straight to the Overfell, the cliff, straight to her. She saw the glitter of rust-black scales and the gleam of the long eyes. She saw the red tongue that was a tongue of flame. The stink of burning filled the wind as with a hissing roar the dragon, turning to land on the shelf of rock, breathed out a sigh of fire. Its feet clashed on the rock, the thorny tail writhing, rattled, and the wings, scarlet where the sun shone through them, stormed and rustled as they folded down to the mailed flanks. The head turned slowly. The dragon looked at the woman who stood there within reach of its scythe blade talons. The woman looked at the dragon. She felt the head of its body. She had been told that men must not look into a dragon's eyes, but that was nothing to her. It's an imposing being. and she's standing there and realizing that this creature has no threat to her, but it's still as intimidating as it's possible to be. Eventually, a creature wants Ged to get down. Ged is almost unconscious. Creature says to Tanar, "Mount me." And she has to walk up the scales, kind of help him down to the ground. Ged roused enough to try to hold on to her, but there was no strength in him. He sprawled off the dragon onto the rock like a sack unloaded and lay there. The dragon turned its immense head and in a completely animal gesture nosed and sniffed at the man's body. It lifted its head and its wings too half lifted with a vast metallic sound. It shifted its feet away from Ged closer to the edge of the cliff, and turning back the head on the thorned neck, it stared once more directly at Tanar, and its voice, like the dry roar of a kiln fire, spoke Thessa Kalessen. The sea wind whistled in the dragon's half-open wings, and she said, Thessa Tanar. They exchanged their true names. Thus they know each other, and thus they granted each other power over themselves. That's the key to magic in Earthsea. The dragon then flies away, leaving Ged. And we don't understand the dragon's purpose, but we understand that the dragon definitely brought Ged back to her and her alone. And so as a woman, what's she gonna do? And this little phrase that I'm gonna read just is very enlightening, especially to a 16, 17-year-old boy. Tanar watched the dragon till it was no larger than a wild goose or a gull as it flew away. The air was cold. When the dragon had been there, it had been hot, furnace hot, with the dragon's inward fire. Tanar shivered. She sat down on the rock beside Ged and began to cry. She hid her face in her arms and wept aloud. "What can I do?" she cried. "What can I do now?" Presently she wiped her eyes and nose on her sleeve, put back her hair with both hands, and turned to the man who lay beside her. He lay so still, so easy on the bare rock, as if he might lie there forever. Tanar's side, there was nothing she could do, but there was always the next thing to be done. A line like that for a boy, young man trying to think about growing up I remember the power of that line saying, there is the perspective of a woman. What can I do? I don't have the power that you have in this life. But you know what? There's always the next thing to be done. I'm going to do it. I hope. I think. I hope I can. Filled with doubts, knowing the lack of strength and power, but realizing, well, maybe that power is here and in me. And then, of course, the book kind of progresses in a slow, really kind of gentle and quiet way of growing Tanar's strength through the entire book. At the same time, she is giving her love, unquestioned, sometimes despairing, to this ruined child. And yet that love builds so strongly through the book that, without giving away any real special spoilers, she gives enough love to Theru, the child, that in the end Theru saves her and Get at the same time. Here's another example of kind of how Le Guin explains woman's power. This is a witch, Moss, who we see there. Moss is elderly. She knows a couple of words of the true language, and she understands that men dominate magic, but she has a little bit of magic. Often witches in this culture are run down as being witches' magic is just bad magic or infantile magic. And Moss says, ours is only a little power, seems like next to theirs, speaking of man. But it goes down deep, it's all roots. It's like an old blackberry thicket. And a wizard's power is like a fir tree, great and tall and grand, but it'll blow right down in the storm. Nothing kills the blackberry bramble. In other words, Tanar, we are strong. You have to find that strength, but it could be deep, deep within you. At the very end of the book is another description of the dragon. And it's an echo of what I read a few moments ago. The dragon shows up, looks at everyone, performs a great deed that's critical to the story I won't really tell you, but then says, looking at the child, Theru, that's her username. The dragon says, Tahana. The dragon can only speak in the true language, the right language of the making. This is Theru's true name. And the child turns to look back at it and says, Kalasa, knowing his true name. And so this is a moment that the mutual respect is kind of established, and it also establishes kind of the double nature of Theru the child. She actually is half dragon and half human. She is one of those and becomes the bridge to the rest of the story. This is Le Guin's phrase about the creation of Dea, which is the creation of the world of Earthsea. Only in silence the word, only in dark light, only in dying life, bright thoughts full on the empty sky. I love that kind of stuff. You don't have to love it as a reader. It's reminiscent of Tolkien's line about where the shadows, Mordor and where the shadows lie. Obviously, Le Guin is looking for a similar thing, but she has made a world which actually really resonates. And in this book, she has brought all of her characters to an equality. So I'm not going to say more about Tahanu. other than pretty much has a happy ending, but it also has an ending that's open to subsequent somethings. The interesting part is that when this book was published, and this one is the one that my mother gave me when it first came out. At the top of that it says the last book of Earthsea, and in fact, Le Guin had determined this was the last book. She was going to end the story this way, and then it was like, I need to know more. and she's a dynamic, prolific writer. She's writing poetry, she's writing other novels, she's writing criticism, she's translating works from different languages, mostly from the French and some Latin, I think, but Romantic languages typically. But she's prolific. Got a big reputation, she's in demand, they want her to come to book fairs and do readings and whatever. But all the time she's ready to dive back into her work at a deeper depth. In the end, when Thoreau calls the dragon and the dragon performs an act which is critical to the story at the end, and then they exchange their true names, the world has really changed again. Earthsea has changed within the story. But so changed, in fact, that Le Guin herself said, I need to go back into it. So she did return to Earthsea. She wrote The Tales from Earthsea, which is 5 more short stories that delve into the archipelago and some of the stories, some very ancient history, some more contemporary to these books. And then one short story, which is kind of long, short story called Dragonflight, is a direct link between Tahanu, the 4th book, which was the last book, and now has become the 4th and a half book, and then the short stories Dragonfly, and then she finishes it off with a novel called The Other Wind. Tahanu is that pivot point. It's the reimagining of Earthsea's true power. It's very surprising to the unsuspecting or blinkered reader. It's controversial even to Le Guin's previous fans. It's a toppling of what we all understood about Earthsea, but it's also deftly logical. It's tightly logical. It's maybe inevitable when you really think about it for the story arc. And the tales and legends and all the characters, indeed all of Earthsea, it becomes so much better understood through this book and then beyond by both the author and the reader. It's really a great achievement by Le Guin to return to a beloved world and see those changes and then have the courage to explore them. And she says, quote, by the time I wrote this book, I needed to look at heroics from outside and underneath, from the point of view of the people who are not included, the ones who can't do magic, the ones who don't have shining staffs or swords, women, kids, the poor, the old, the powerless, unheroes, ordinary people, my people. I didn't want to change Earthsea, but I needed to see what Earthsea looked like to us. And so she wrote that reinvention, and it honors us as readers. It demands our intelligence, it demands our understanding, a little patience, but boy, the rewards are wonderful. So for me, it's just a really amazing accomplishment that I absolutely love. Another quote from her when she died before this book was published in 2018, but she had written an introduction to it in 2016 that was eventually used. And in that introduction, she talks specifically about The Other Wind as her last novel of Earthsea, but it gives you an idea of the power, even to her, of her own creations and what they demanded of her as an author. She says in this introduction, The Other Wind presented itself to me without explaining itself, urgent, imperative, final. If a dragon comes to you and says, sobriost, which means now, mount, you don't ask questions. You do what it says. There is a great taloned foot set like a step in front of you, and above it, the crook of an elbow joint, and above that, the jutting shoulder blade, a stairway. You clamber up that stairway, feeling the fiery inner heat of the dragon's body. You settle yourself between the vast wings, take hold of the big spine thorn before you, and the dragon lifts, takes off, takes you where you and it must go, flying on the other wing, flying free. That's it, and that's what she did. So, great quote about libraries right there from Le Guin, and then that little couplet, if you will, almost, of the other wind, which kind of she had written for Tahano and inspired her to find what the other wind was and fly on it and create the last books of Earthsea, which are then compiled in this gigantic monster bookstop, which is filled with some really nice illustrations as well, but it compiles all the stories of Earthsea, the short stories, the long novels, and then a couple of commentaries as well are in this thing. If you really want to explore Earthsea, you can do it all in one, but you're going to get really big biceps if you're reading this thing. So that's it. If you have any questions, be happy to take them. It's almost 1 o'clock. Yeah. Well, yell at me too, because my ears aren't very good.
Come on over here and talk about it. Do you know anything about her life, her biographical life?
Yeah, a little bit.
How she got to write books like
Yeah.
this?
Where the immense imagination comes from is kind of hard to say. She grew up in Northern California. Her father was a professor, and her mom was very active in the whole community that she was in. They were relatively wealthy, very comfortable, again, drenched in books and publications and thought. They were extremely liberal as parents, in the sense of you need to understand that our life, the comfort of our life, is not typical for one thing, but also all peoples in the whole world have different lives. And you need to be aware of that. So how does one become aware of that? Through reading of obviously factual information and history, but also through story. And so she was always kind of steeped in story, I think, as just growing up. And I don't quite know why she had the gumption to enter the sci-fi kind of realm, which was, I mean, there might not have even been one other woman writing sci-fi at the time she wrote. But in the late 50s, when she started writing short stories, she was determined. I think she was aware that she had talent, that her writing was good, and she had developed political leanings toward, well, anti-capitalist might be a little too strong, but certainly unsympathetic to where capitalism takes you in the long run. Not as far as anarchy, but interested in anarchy as a condition which could be explored and then threaded out. And so that she would say to herself, where, if we did have our anarchy, where would that go? So she was always thinking about, if I have something true here, what happens if that's logically taken to its furthest extent? She also played with gender, most famously probably in The Left Hand of Darkness, which is a Hugo Award winner, one of the great sci-fi novels, top 10 sci-fi novel maybe. AJ's kind of an expert on that. It sort of depends how you approach it, but one of the great, highly honored science fiction novels, The Left Hand of Darkness. And in that, the characters are, well, the main character is a person from the Ecumen, who's the giant universal federation of nations, comes to a planet, and they're looking to kind of incorporate them eventually into the Ecumen. And that planet, the people are I don't know my terminology well enough. Sexually, they can be either female or male, and most times they are neither, but then in rut, they become either female or male. Creates some very interesting things for the culturally to explore, and of course, the main character who's not from the planet is like us. A person who's trying to figure out what's going on here, but has a good heart and doesn't want to just, not looking for conquering or to kill off this culture, but is now lost within the culture and trying to grasp it. The whole thing is just a fascinating, really smart exploration of where that can go. And I think she took that concept as a writer and really did that with all of her writings through time. I believe, I'm thinking of what I think her father was a professor in archaeology, which was a really big factor in understanding that history has depth and that all the layers can be uncovered, physically as well as emotionally in here. And I think that's probably where she comes from. But why anyone is as gifted and as thoughtful as her is always hard to explain. Certain authors are just, she's great with words, she's incredibly great with thoughts, incredible dialogue of realistic dialogue that actually comes across as how we speak, not just laying it all blatantly, in an info dump. Sci-fi is kind of famous for information dumps where the author has to catch you up with what's going on. That was very rarely happened in a Le Guin book. You had to figure out what was going on in most of her stuff. Sorry, long answer. Yes?
Did you meet her in person?
I never met her in person. One of my really big regrets would I have actually gone up and actually shaken her hand if I had the opportunity? Certainly, but I remember, it's 2024 now. She died in early 2018, I think, or late 2017. I've kind of forgotten, but 2015, 2014, I think she made an appearance at the Ottawa, Ontario Book Festival, and I remember seeing that coming up and saying to my wife, "Man, I might have to go." and my son's birthday, younger son's birthday, is around the same time, so I'll blame him. I didn't go. I wish I had. Just wondering whether she had an aura which would just magically transmit itself to me, and so that my own doodlings would become better. Those are the silly things that you think of, but I'm not extremely well read, but I'm pretty, I'm doing all right. But for me, she's right at the very top of storytelling and the effectuation of language and how it works. And the craft is just, to me, the best. Maybe the best that I've ever read, and that's overstatement because you can have opinions on that all over the place. But she affects me more than a Steinbeck or a Twain or even if you look at some I really like a writer who's writing procedural detective stories, Ian Rankin. Right now, I'm reading pretty much every Ian Rankin book. As a character who's a Scottish inspector. Really, really good writer about dialogue and the needles we give each other and influencing and stuff like that. It's really fun, and yet still kind of a ghost of what Le Guin was achieving for me. Partially because I definitely love fantasy. I did finally read Lord of the Rings. I read it after the Earthsea trilogy, before Tehama. And I pulled a couple all-nighters in late high school reading, Lord of the Rings because I just loved it. But Tolkien's truths, which are nothing to sneeze at, about how power can corrupt and and our fear of death will make us do impossibly wrong things. But his characters have as much as I love them, have very few of them, I'll say, have the three-dimensionality that Le Guin's characters have. Le Guin's characters are so human that they penetrate right to me. And that won't necessarily happen for you, but I recommend giving her a shot. Now the first three books, Tehanu, the first three books are definitely aimed at a younger audience. She was breaking in to it that way, but Tehanu takes it to a different level. It's absolutely an adult novel, and just has depths that are greater and more fun to dig into. Okay? Hey, thanks a lot. I hope you go out to the bookshelves and grab another good book.